Welcome back to the third lecture. This is the last one on the introduction, and we will move on to topic. I just briefly touched about the structural color in the dying moments of the previous lecture. So, you can sort of have a quick glimpse of what it is. So, they can either couple up in phase. So, they can interfere constructively. This is a constructive interference in the in phase, as you can see here. This in fact enhances the brightness, or but they cancel out if they sort of interfere in out of phase. So, this sort of enhances or extinguishes light of different wavelength and changing the color of the object. Now, a compact disc in fact has some structures which are the track where the data is stored, and it turns out, I will show you AFM pictures later. It turns out that the track width over here is of the order of 1.5 micron, the track periodicity. The track width is about 750 nanometer. The wavelength of visible light is 400 to 700 nanometer. So, if you sort of tilt a compact disc, what happens is that there is a destructive interference or diffraction, and you see rainbow color. Now, it is the structural color is not only limited to compact discs. There are a whole lot of example of structural color in the animal kingdom. For example, the beautiful color of butterfly is often attributed to a combination of pigments and structures. There are some butterflies which sort of glow at night, and that is primarily because of these type of structures. And this type of color does not originate from pigments, but they form due to diffraction and presence of micron size structures, as we have already told. Again, as I have told that in the animal kingdom or in the lower strata of the life, many functionalities are attributed either in cloaking, so that you are not sort of endangered. You can hide from somebody who is trying to eat you up or attack you, or you can also hide when you want to attack somebody. And the structural color allows insects, even many other category of creatures, to camouflage on demand, as the color visible to the predator is a function of illuminating light as well. There is in fact a very fascinating, lot of very fascinating research that goes on about the color in the animal kingdom. And one quick example I will pick up is sort of a fantasy many of us had as children, is can a chameleon actually change its color? And it turns out that to a certain extent, may not be all possible colors, because a chameleon might be either staying close to a bush or plants or leaves, or may be close to the ground, which is gray or dusty. So, within these two shades of color, it in fact can change its color to a limited extent. And what it can do, as you can see from this picture, it has certain surface structures. So, depending on the excitement or the ambience, they can sort of erect some hairs, or maybe make these structures stiffer, and as a consequence of that, the interference changes, and indeed they can partially change colors. There was another very interesting study about 10 years back from a group of researchers in Cambridge University, and that in fact told that insects, and many of us know, have studied in our school days biological science, that insects have compound eye. So, it was earlier believed that compound eye give insects roughly a 360-degree vision, wide vision, again so that they can see who is trying to attack them, or they can identify if there is something which they can eat up. But there is something more to that. In fact, insect eyes double up as microscopes, because it was shown in this landmark 2007 science paper by a group of researchers in Cambridge University, that insects actually identify some structural color. They actually identify the structures. So, our perception of vision is like we identify something that is blue if it's appearing as blue, but because structure like a compact disc, we see only the rainbow colors, but insects, it turns out, actually can identify structures. So, the experiment that was done, in a very quick nutshell, certain insects were trained to migrate to a particular variety of flower which has, let us say, red color, and these structures on the flower were replicated in some other material. This is something that you are going to learn in this course, how to replicate these structures. And then that replicated structures, so insects were seen to migrate to those replicated structures because the structures on those flowers were identical to that red flower. And most interestingly, when these replicated structures were illuminated with some other color, the insects were still found to migrate to them. So it clearly shows that whether the structures, it clearly shows that in fact it is the structures that matters to them, and not whether the object is illuminated blue, red or green, like the way we would typically identify color. There are many other applications like holograms, moth eye effect, or anti-reflection surfaces. For example, you can see there is a glass coated with anti-reflection surface. You do not see the reflection of the tube light in your room. They actually have some nano and micro scale structures, waveguides, but this anti-reflection surface probably I will spend some time on making some of them, because we make them routinely in our lab, things like that. There is another very fascinating application that is research is still going on, it is not fully realized, but it is a good keyword for all of you to learn at this stage, is the so called metamaterials. I do not know how many of you know about these metamaterials, or they are also called the negative refractive index material, but if they are realized, they are artificial materials, you do not see these type of metamaterials in nature, but if they are realized, that will in fact lead to invisibility or cloaking. Yes, that is exactly what it is. So you can look into this image which I have downloaded, but it is a bit controversial. So people say there is a morphed image or whatever. So this might not be very far away possibility, that you can in fact come up with metamaterial which makes cloaking or invisibility possible. In fact, the latest state of art in metamaterials is that cloaking in the microwave wavelength has already been achieved with some structures, specific structures, but when one goes down to the optical wavelength, there are certain scaling issues and the classical approach is failing. So the latest development that is taking from Professor Uli Steiner's lab in Switzerland is that they are using some block copolymers, a special type of block copolymers, then they backfill it with metal and things like that, which is very close to achieving this desired property. And these block copolymers, as one of the introductory slides we already pointed out, that they are in fact related to this internally structured, nanostructured materials. So now you see that I think I have given a few examples which sort of convinces you that there are many cases where it is possible to sort of have extraordinary properties arising out of nanostructures present on let us say the surface of a material, right. So we will look into one of them in somewhat detail, and that is this effect of hydrophobicity, because that is also very important for our other understanding. So that is something we will learn, and there are other examples also. For example, reusable super adhesives, which is known as the gecko effect, because a house lizard or a gecko can sort of defy the gravity and climb along the wall, which you can't. But there is, so their legs have super adhesive property, but there is something more. These super adhesives, they can also detach very easily, because if you really stick something with a very high quality glue like Fevikwik, you yourself need a lot of energy to detach these fingers, but this small animal does not have, its metabolism won't sustain or provide him so much energy to detach. So not only their legs or feet come with super adhesive pads, but there are capabilities that allows them to detach very easily, and they are clean. If you take a sellotape, for example, and stick it onto a surface, well, first time it will stick. If you peel it off from there, try to stick it the second time, it may stick, third time onwards it will definitely not stick. Why? Because some dust or something might have attached to it and it has spoiled. But this is not the case with, let us say, these animals, where they go on using their legs again and again and again. So they are reusable, clean, super adhesive with easy detachment, and this is attributed to, again, to the presence of some structures on their feet. So a whole lot of application in the biological world, animal kingdom, everywhere. But if I ask you a question, what is the biggest application area of patterning? Take a minute to guess. Well, I am sure all of you will agree to this transformation. Probably as kids at home, even 15 years back, you have seen stuff like this, where the Pentium 2 processor or something like that, and now you have Core i7 processors and things like that, and this is also an old picture, about 5-6 years old picture. So, what has led to this transformation? And this transformation, this rapid, faster processors, higher capacity memories or storage devices, they are all attributed to nothing but patterning technique, and that is the application of patterning in microelectronics. And the progress, it is not an overstatement that the progress in microelectronics is significantly attributed to progress in a patterning technique, which is known as photolithography. Why it is so? Because what is as we all know that these are semiconductor devices. So, you have what is a semiconductor? It is essentially a junction between a p type and an n type material, often it is silicon doped with p and n. But one particular junction, p-n junction, is not going to serve the purpose of a high speed computer. So, what you need to do? You need to have arrays of these p-n junctions, right? And as you have larger number of these junctions, of course, the processor speed sort of shoots up. So, at heart of a computer processor, you have these p-n junctions, right? So, they are all silicon, but you have areas which are p type doped and areas which are n type doped. That is something that we will not go. We will just learn how the system works, but we will not go into all the details. But they are sort of seamless. So, it is on the same block, because if you bring in blocks of p type doped material and n type doped material and try to sort of stitch them together, there is going to be a lot of loss at the interfaces and your performance will drop. These are details that are beyond the requirement of this course, but I mean, what we are going to talk you can understand very easily. So, one of the tricks of enhancing the processor speed, of course, would be to add more and more number of these p-n junctions. But as you go on increasing the number of these p-n junctions, your device size and everything goes up, and that is not what you would like to achieve, and that is not where the development is taking place. Because you see, now you had 10 years or 15 years back, you had big boxes as PCs, and now you have almost everything in your cell phone or mobile or small size laptops, which perform as good as your regular office desktop. So, how can that be done? So, certainly it is a technological requirement to add more number of these p-n junctions, but certainly increase in size is against the general trend. So, if this is sort of an array of these p-n junctions, let us say this gray area corresponds to p and this yellow area corresponds to n type domains, one way you can increase the number density of these junctions, thereby increasing the processor speed and not increase the size, is if you can make these domains smaller and smaller. And that is exactly what has been done, right? And how this is done is something that you are going to learn, and this is in fact done by photolithography. And you can just Google with photolithography. Photolithography is something that we will probably take up after 2 or 3 lectures, or maybe a little later. This is what is known as photolithography, but it is extremely important from the standpoint of microelectronic industry, and this is sort of silicon electronics as it is called. Photolithography is the industry standard, or the only technique for creating these semiconductors, or these basic these p-n junctions, which are absolutely essential for making the computer chips or the processors. For example, the Pentium 2 processor had lines which were 300 nanometer wide, right. So, let us say these are the domains, and each of the domains are sort of 300 nanometer wide, and this I5 core, in fact, the present state of art is somewhere around 16 to 20 nanometer. I5 core has 32 nanometer wide lines. So, here the line width has gone down to 32 nanometer. So, one PN junction, let us say in a older processor, would have taken 600 nanometer of space, right, because each one is about 300 nanometer wide. And now you can understand this is 32. So, two adjacent domains will have a width of about 64 nanometer, that is like roughly around 60 nanometer. This is 600 nanometer. So, in place where there was only one PN junction, now in fact there are 10 number of PN junctions packed in that same location. So, now you can see why the processor speeds are up, and this tremendous progress in microelectronics is something that is related to, or it is attributed entirely to nano patterning. That is something that you are going to learn as a part of this course, because if you remember the first lecture where I introduced you to the contents, photolithography is one of the major things. We are going to spend at least 3 to 4 lectures on photolithography, so that at least you learn the basic. Almost similar that higher capacity memories are also attributed to something like that, but there are certain additional issues, and therefore, I will avoid a detailed discussion. But classical microelectronics is, as we all know, it is silicon electronics, but with advancement of technology, you now have things like flexible display and stuff like that. Silicon is a very rigid material, so you cannot really have make flexible electronics out of it. Therefore, lot of emphasis is now also going on polymer electronics, so polymer based electronics or plastic electronics for making things that are flexible. And there are also technologies, patterning technologies compatible to flexible objects or conformal with flexible devices are coming up. So, here also you can see that nano patterning plays a very, very important role. Before moving on, I would just like to highlight one aspect of this so called nano fabrication, and this is a slide we will revisit later again. And what are the, and what I would like to say is, and this is valid for any fabrication technique also, even in the macro scale, that what are the major paradigms or major approaches in nano fabrication or mesoscale fabrication. Now, one of the approaches can be like the top down approaches. Top down approaches, as you will find, is that in micro or nano fabrication, the lithography based approaches are the top down approaches. A better example of top down approach is, let us say, carving out a cave in a mountain. So, you had a chunk of rock and you cut out things to achieve something desired. The other approach can of course be the bottom up approach, where you start from individual building blocks. At the nanoscale, the individual building blocks can be even molecules, and you sort of assemble them in a specific order to come up with something desired. Lego bricks or Lego blocks with which the children play, or the way you build your home with bricks, they are all examples of bottom up fabrication technique, right. However, there is a critical problem at the nanoscale, and that is, whatever be the individual building blocks, you do not have your hands at the nanoscale, or even a tweezer does not work. So, question becomes, how do you assemble these individual blocks to achieve something desirable? And it is in this context I will talk about surfactants, which show extraordinary self organization based on infactuatability contrast, and that is something that is going to come up next. The third approach, so these are the two very well established approaches for the different approaches for nano fabrication, the top down and the bottom up. As you are learning this particular course, you should be aware of a third fabrication approach, and that is becoming popular slowly. It is a very novel and recent concept, and that is what is known as self organization. and I have drawn a cartoon here which should resemble you something that we talked I think in the previous lecture, and that is the spontaneous instability in a thin film. So, if we can quickly recapitulate what is the thing we argued. We argued that if you take a film which is thin, there is a possibility that there might be active interfacial van der Waals interaction between the two interfaces, right, and depending on the nature of this interaction, the film might remain stable, nothing happens to it, which is great. Or if the, so one can now add more detail to it, the net interaction between the two interfaces has to be repulsive. Why? If you are understanding, it is fine, even if you are not understanding, does not matter, this is something we will do in great detail. However, if the net interaction between the two interfaces is attractive, there is a possibility that the film might disintegrate. In fact, what will happen is these two separate interfaces might merge. This is the fundamental physics of spontaneous instability in a thin film. And duetting. So, as I told in that cartoon that these leads to structures, and these structures are often very small in lateral dimension. So, here is the new concept, new approach. Well, if your thin film is unstable due to whatever reason, the reason for which you are going to learn, it is not good for the coating application. It fails as a coating, which is very bad news, because in many applications you actually need coating, and we also argued that you in fact often tend to enhance the thickness of the coating, like you ask the painter to coat 2 layers of paint, so that you avoid this type of a possible catastrophic failure due to spontaneous instability, right. But even if your film becomes unstable, that is also not a bad news, because an unstable film, as you can see, is often leading to some sort of nanostructures, and since we already argued that at the nanoscale you do not have hands or tools, it is difficult to fabricate structures. So, this can be a novel approach, and in fact, this is what is known as self organization, which is, and as you will understand when I go into bit of detail, in fact, for both bottom up and top down approaches, bottom up as well as self organization approaches. This bottom up approaches often are referred to as the self assembly approaches. They are driven by a desire for energy minimization. So, you all know that from thermodynamics that a natural process always works towards energy minimization. Of course, in a top down approach, you apply energy from outside to achieve your desired structures. So, with that, I think we are quite comfortable now with the motivation of the course. We understand that nano pattern surfaces have whole lot of applications. It is responsible for certain properties which are not related to the bulk property of the material, but are related to the surface structures, and therefore, we also sort of understand the key motivation of this particular course. We are going to look into two apparently different aspects, and which are going to eventually, towards the end of the course, we will realize that they sort of seamlessly merge with each other. One of the aspects is nano patterning, of soft surfaces, I emphasize this word soft surfaces because we will stick mostly to polymers and things like that. The second one is spontaneous instability in ultra thin films. So, where is nano here? This ultra thin is like less than 100 nanometer, and these are sort of structures which are nano and the meso scale. So, these are sort of the two key things which, to start with, they will look slightly decoupled to you, which we will focus on. In fact, this is easier. So, we will start off with this one after we are done up with certain basic concepts, and then we also need, in fact, in both the cases we will be needing the atomic force microscope, because you may feel that you have made some nano patterns, but it is extremely important for you to see how the patterns actually look, and that is where your AFM will help you significantly. But you will yourself see towards the end how beautifully these two things merge seamlessly in some sort of coming up, particularly with what we just discussed in self organized nano fabrication techniques, or in other words, they merge to come up or lead to novel strategies for manipulating objects at the nano scale. So, with that I will stop here this lecture I will stop here, and we will start off with some fundamental aspects related to surface and interfaces in the next lecture. Thank you.